Welcome back. In the last video, I said we were going to pick up right where we left off and talk about types of qualitative research and also the pros and cons of different types of qualitative research. The two types of qualitative research that I want to highlight in this part of the video are phenomenology and field studies. There are other types of qualitative research that can be done, but these are the two that I want us to focus on. So let's start with phenomenology. Phenomenology is just a big word for introspection or self-observation. When a person does phenomenology, the person observes his or her own internal experiences, thoughts, and feelings, and uses that information to draw conclusions. And this was very common in the early days of psychology. If you look up the introspection method, you'll learn that in the very first psychology lab in the 1800s, they used this method, and the researchers would actually ask people to do introspection, and data would be collected that way. But then the introspection method fell out of favor in the early 20th century because in that period of time, the behaviorists like Pavlov and Skinner took over. You might remember learning about Pavlov and Skinner in general psychology. Pavlov discovered classical conditioning, which is, well, the most common example is when a bell rings and the dog learns to pair that with food. Skinner discovered operant conditioning, which is reinforcement and punishment for behavior. But when these people took over, the behaviorists, they said that we shouldn't study thoughts and feelings at all because they can't be directly observed. The behaviorists said we should only study observable behavior. That's why, well, that's where the word behaviorism comes from. So the behaviorists only focused on behaviors that can be seen and verified. So they ended up recording lots of observations like animals running through a maze. In their time, it was common for a researcher to put a rat in a maze and watch it go through the maze and record the amount of time it takes to reach the end, to reach a prize or a piece of food. So the behaviorists, well, some people might argue that they weren't looking at very interesting issues, but a lot of that just has to do with how they said, we can only focus on observable behavior. We can't study thoughts and feelings because it's not scientific. But then things have turned back. So now it's okay to study thoughts and feelings in modern psychology, but the way people do study thoughts and feelings today is more advanced compared to back in the early days of introspection. The field has progressed a lot since then. So people today don't use research methods in the same way that they were done back then. Okay, so now this was important in the history of psychology. I just talked about that in the 1800s, but phenomenology in its pure, simple form has very limited usefulness as a research method. It's not reliable. It's not dependable. And I want to talk a little about why that's the case. Well, first of all, they've actually done studies in modern psychology that have shown evidence that people aren't very good at introspection. They found evidence that often what a person thinks is causing his or her behavior isn't actually the true cause. So if you go and ask a person, what causes you to feel, well, imagine someone comes up to you and says, I feel nervous whenever I'm driving. And you ask the person, well, what do you think is causing you to feel anxious when you're driving? The answer that the person gives you is likely to not be the true cause. So if the person says, I feel anxious when I'm driving because other people are following too close behind me, that might not be the actual cause of what's making them nervous. It's likely, or there's a high chance, that the true cause of their anxiety is something else in that situation, other than what they told you. Like I said, people tend to not be very good at doing introspection and pinpointing what's causing them to think or feel a certain way in a certain situation. So, like I said, this research method isn't very reliable in its pure form. I want to go over a few specific reasons why phenomenology is problematic.